So the project I'll be presenting today is joint work with Eduardo Montero. The project is called Concessions, Violence, and Indirect Rule, Evidence from the Congo Free State. Okay. So as Elias was saying, what we were interested in this project was exploring the effects of private concession companies. And the context we were interested in is the Congo Free State, which is the present day Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we first sort of read about this in the context of Adam Hochschild's work in this book called King Leopold's Ghost, where he documents sort of what these concession companies were like and some of the horrific sort of effects of these different companies. So the map on this screen is a 1904 map of all the concessions that had been granted in Congo at that time. So these are concessions to private companies that have basically monopoly rights over extraction of resources in these areas. And so you can see that sort of a lot of Congo by 1904 had been allocated to these private companies. And sort of what Hochschild writes in his book is that the world has managed to forget one of the great mass killings of recent history. It was unmistakably clear that the Congo of a century ago had indeed seen a death toll of Holocaust dimensions. So sort of staggering negative impacts of these companies is sort of what he's writing about in that book. And so we were interested then in trying to understand what exactly happened and what are the long run effects of these concessions. And so a couple of things to keep in mind is, what's really great about this setup is that I'll be talking really in depth about what happened in the Congo Free State, and then we're going to get more information on concessions across sub-Saharan Africa. But at least for the Congo Free State, these private concessions that were granted to these companies were basically characterized by a couple of key factors. So the first is that they were able to use extreme violence to force people to work for them and to extract the natural resources within the concession boundaries. And then a second sort of characterizing feature of these concessions is that they would often co-opt and coerce local leaders into supporting their regime. And so we're going to call this indirect rule. And so we're just going to keep this in mind when we're trying to understand what are the long run effects of these concessions, that they were really characterized by extreme violence and by the co-option of these local leaders. So we're going to try to answer 3 different questions by studying the Congo Free State and these concessions in the Northern Congo Free State. The first is exposure to this form of economic production, so this colonial concession system, important for understanding relative underdevelopment of parts of sub-Saharan Africa? We're going to find evidence that indeed it is important for understanding development, that places that were arbitrarily just inside these concession companies relative to places that were arbitrarily just outside of these concession boundaries have lower levels of education, wealth, and health, even today, over 100 years after these concessions ended. We'll also then ask, did these concessions lead to less accountable leaders? And so this is particularly because of what we understand from the history that these concession companies would co-opt local leaders and coerce them into supporting sort of the extraction and their regime. And we hypothesize that this may have had long-lasting negative effects on local institutions. And so what we'll find is that indeed sort of inside these former concession areas, village chiefs are more likely to be hereditary and less likely to be elected. And they're also providing fewer public goods. And so we'll consider that as sort of proxies for institutional quality. And then finally, we'll ask, how did these colonial concessions shape social norms? And we'll collect data on levels of cohesion, levels of trust, and levels of support for redistribution. And we'll find that sort of interestingly, it seems that these concessions may have actually created more pro-social norms. And so later on in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how sort of the effects on institutions, the negative effects on institutions may have led to sort of a response in terms of more pro-social norms. So King Leopold II acquired Congo Free State as his personal colony in 1885. He was supposed to, and sort of based on his negotiations with other European powers, he had promised to maintain the Congo Free State as a free trade zone that would be open to everyone who could then come and trade. And for a while, it did operate as this free trade zone. But at some point, he basically decides that he's going to declare himself the owner of all uninhabited lands, which obviously people were living there. And then he divides then the Congo Free State into different parcels, some of which go to these private concession companies, and some of which were allocated to himself as part of a crown domain. That was basically his private kind of concession company. Okay, and so we're interested in the 2 concessions that he granted in the northern Congo. These are called Abir and Anversoise, and these are basically the largest concessions that were granted in the north, and they focused almost primarily, or almost exclusively on the extraction of rubber. And then importantly for sort of trying to understand the long run effects of these concessions, the boundaries were established using salient geographic features, so the extent of river basins, and we can think of this as sort of quasi-exogenous variation and sort of why people were exposed to these concessions. Okay, so here's a map of Abir and Anversoise concessions. You can see that the concession boundaries seem to align more or less with the extent of river basins, which is going to be important for trying to estimate the causal effects of these concessions. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how these concessions were run. So they were interested in collecting natural rubber. They would force people to collect rubber on behalf of the company as a form of what they called paying taxes. The Congo Free State granted these companies with police powers and rights of detention. The companies were also given support from the force publique soldiers to basically coerce people into the collection of rubber. In addition, the companies would maintain their own militias. They would arm these militias with guns. So they would be the only people in the area who would have these types of weapons. And so the labor system basically was set up in this following way. The company would establish posts within the concession boundaries. 1 to 2 European agents would be assigned to each post, and then they would have armed post and village sentries that would be stationed both within the posts and within the surrounding villages. And then these sentries would be tasked with making sure people met their rubber quotas. Okay, so in 1904, a group of people get sent to investigate sort of all of the atrocities that were happening in the Congo Free State. This led to basically Abir and Anversoise leaving the Congo Free State in 1906, though sort of this also happened to coincide with the fact that they had basically nearly exhausted the natural rubber supplies by this time as well. By 1908, the Congo Free State is turned over to the Belgians, so it's no longer King Leopold's personal colony, it's now a Belgian colony. And then sort of rubber production was no longer really relevant because there was competitive production of rubber, not the type of rubber that was grown in Congo, but rubber through tree plantations after 1910. So what we're going to be interested in is trying to understand first if there are negative long-run effects on development outcomes. And to do that, to test whether or not that's the case, we're going to take data from the demographic and health surveys for Congo. And then we're going to take our digitized boundaries of our 2 concessions of interest, Abir and Anversoise. And then we'll ask, do places that happen to be just inside these boundaries relative to places that happen to be just outside of these boundaries have worse development outcomes today? So this is a map showing the boundaries of our concessions of interest, as well as data that we have from these DHS surveys. So the little dots represent different villages that were interviewed during these DHS surveys. And we'll basically ask is, if we compare places that are just outside these boundaries relative to places that are just inside, do we see worse outcomes inside these boundaries? So the first set of outcomes that we're going to look at are going to be education. So here are the results for education. So in short, what we find is that if you're inside a former concession, you have basically 1.8 fewer years of education on average relative to those places just outside. So this is actually a fairly large effect size. We can also look at wealth as an outcome. So the DHS collects a lot of different information on assets, and then they construct an index that's taking into account all the different types of things people might own, like bicycles, cars, TVs, whatever. And what we'll find is that, again, being inside one of these former concessions, being relative to being just outside one of these former concessions, you are less wealthy on this wealth index score. And then finally, we also look at some health outcomes. So the DHS collects some nice data on height for age, which can be a really good proxy for access to nutrition, particularly for children. And we'll find that both female respondents to the DHS survey, as well as their children, are on average shorter inside of these concessions for their age. So this is sort of a good proxy for sort of access to nutrition as a child in particular. And it suggests on average that these places are worse off also in terms of health outcomes. And, you know, we do a lot of different robustness tests to show that these results really seem to be identifying the actual effect of exposure to these concessions. So one interesting exercise we do is say, okay, you know, these concessions ended over 100 years ago. Like, why, or should we still expect to see effects? And one thing we do is just show that, you know, surprisingly, perhaps, these effects seem to be really persistent. So if we look by birth cohort at the effect of being inside these concessions relative to just outside, you can see that for each birth cohort, so those born in 1950, those born in 1980, those born in 1990, you see this negative effect on education, this negative effect on wealth, et cetera. So one way to think about that is that you might expect to see convergence over time, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So in conclusion, in our paper, we're trying to understand the long-run consequences of this very popular sort of form of economic production, so this colonial concession system. In our setting, these are characterized by extreme violence and the co-option of local leaders. And we combine sort of survey and experimental data to show that these concessions seem to have long-run negative persistent effects on development and seem to have affected institutional quality and pro-social norms. Thank you.